All right, so we're diving into something really fascinating today. The story behind how Congregationalism took root, specifically here in Brazil.
Yeah, it's easy to assume that these big religious movements just kind of appear out of nowhere, fully formed. But when we really dig into the history here, it reveals some pretty unique and unexpected things about how this specific church structure actually became established in Brazil.
Absolutely. We often see the end result, the established institution, but rarely do we get to trace the steps back to its very beginnings.
Exactly. So exploring congregationalism in Brazil means we're really looking at a significant part of Brazilian religious history as a whole.
A vital thread, you could say.
Absolutely, a vital thread. And what we really want to do in this deep dive is, grasp the fundamental principles that have shaped this particular way of organizing a church, and of course, understand the very specific journey it took here in Brazil.
Right. It's about uncovering those distinct origins and really defining the characteristics of Brazilian Congregationalism.
Exactly. Paying close attention to the historical context, the specific circumstances in which it all came together. And I think right from the start, there's one central figure we absolutely can't skip over: Robert Reed Calley.
Oh, absolutely. He's a crucial figure in this story, a real pioneer.
He really is. Coming in as an independent missionary with a very clear goal in mind.
Right. So our mission today is to unpack all of that, the distinctive origins, the core characteristics, with a keen eye on the historical forces at play.
Couldn't have put it better myself.
Okay, so let's begin with the arrival of Robert and Sarah Calley in Brazil back in 1855. I think what immediately struck me when going through the sources was their very clear, almost laser-focused purpose in coming here.
Yeah, they didn't just kind of wander over.
No, not at all. They journeyed here with a very specific goal of converting Brazilians to Protestantism.
They were intentional, driven.
Precisely. And that in itself is an important point to consider, right? It reveals a deliberate strategy, an early indication of a desire to reach a diverse population.
Absolutely. I think one of the fascinating aspects to consider here, building on what you just said, is who exactly they were trying to reach.
Right, their intended audience.
Yeah. You see, the sources really emphasize this point. Calley's approach was, in many ways, quite groundbreaking, because if you look back at previous missionary efforts, they largely concentrated on the foreign colonists who are already in Brazil.
They were serving those who, in a sense, were already familiar.
Yeah. But Calley, his vision was different. He was very much focused on engaging directly with the Portuguese-speaking population.
Directly with Brazilians themselves.
Precisely.
And it's equally significant to remember that Calley wasn't operating under the umbrella of, say, some big British or North American denomination.
Oh, no. That's absolutely key.
He was out there on his own, wasn't he? He's an independent missionary.
Through and through.
And that independence, I think, plays a huge role in how this whole movement initially unfolds. It was almost like he had this personal, almost laser-focused mission for Brazil.
Yes. Unburdened, you might say, by the agendas or the structures of those larger organizations back home.
And that freedom, that independence, allowed for a unique trajectory, didn't it?
It really did. It shaped everything.
Now, the sources also give us these quite vivid glimpses into their initial experiences upon arriving in Brazil. They landed in Rio de Janeiro, and it sounds like what they encountered was quite a shock.
It wasn't the tropical paradise they might have imagined.
Not at all. It's described as this noisy, unclean environment. There's mention of serious diseases being prevalent.
It paints a picture of hardship, doesn't it?
It really does. It makes you think about, well, their resilience. I mean, imagine arriving with this grand vision, this purpose, and being met with such challenging conditions.
It speaks to their unwavering commitment, doesn't it? That they persevered despite those initial hurdles.
And the sources tell us that these initial challenges in Rio led them to seek out a different setting, one more conducive to Sarah Calley's well-being, specifically.
Right, they eventually moved to Petropolis, didn't they? Drawn by the promise of a more European atmosphere and, of course, the milder climate.
Right, Petropolis offered them a respite, a chance to adjust and acclimate.
Yeah.
But even with this move, even with the initial difficulties, Calley's missionary zeal, his drive, it never wavered.
It's actually quite remarkable when you think about it.
It is, and it's incredible that just a few short months after their arrival, in August of 1855, they established the very first Sunday school.
There they go, planting those seeds.
And get this. It was trilingual, catering to German, Portuguese, and English speakers. I mean, that's incredible.
Isn't it? It really underscores the makeup of the community they were trying to reach.
It does. It emphasizes diversity.
And Callie, right from the start, he's making an effort to connect with everyone present, to build those bridges.
He's laying the foundation for a broader movement.
He is. He's thinking long term. And, what's particularly interesting about this initial Sunday school is that it really served as, well, the seed from which the first church would eventually grow.
It was the starting point.
It was. It demonstrates Callie's practicality, his understanding of building community.
We started with education.
Exactly. Education as a foundational element, to foster the growth of the Protestant faith among Brazilians.
Which leads us directly to the birth of the first church, right?
The Igreja Evangélica Fluminense in Rio de Janeiro, established in July of 1858.
This marks a truly pivotal moment, I think, in the entire story.
It does, because our sources are very clear on this. This was the first permanent Portuguese-speaking Protestant church established in Brazil.
A landmark achievement. And let's not forget it, the initial group of 14 members.
14 souls embarking on this new venture. It's quite something when you think about it.
It really is. And the group was a blend of British and Portuguese individuals. But crucially, and I think this is really important, it also included the very first Brazilian convert, Pedro Nolasco de Andrade.
Right. His conversion and subsequent membership marked a significant turning point.
And the fact that Pedro Nolasco de Andrade was baptized on the very day the church was formally organized, that must have been an incredibly powerful moment, full of symbolism.
Imagine the hope and excitement of that day.
I know. It's like witnessing the true beginnings of Brazilian participation in this emerging Protestant movement. And then a little later, in 1859, we have another notable event. Callie performs the baptism of two ladies of the court.
Yes. Quite a significant event.
It must have broadened their visibility, right? But it also, understandably, provoked some opposition from the Roman Catholic Church.
Of course, they were the dominant religious authority at the time, and this was a direct challenge to their position.
Exactly. So how significant was this opposition? Did it force Callie and the early church to adapt your approach in any way?
That's a very important question to consider. While our sources don't specifically detail any immediate strategic shifts, we can reasonably assume that this public opposition from such a powerful institution would have forced them to proceed with a degree of caution. It likely influenced how they approached outreach and engagement within Brazilian society moving forward.
A recalibration, perhaps.
Perhaps, yes.
Okay, so we have this independent missionary who successfully establishes the first Portuguese-speaking Protestant church in Brazil. These initial conversions spark the growth of the movement. So let's turn our attention now to the very structure that defines this emerging movement.
Right, let's get into the nuts and bolts of it.
Exactly. Let's talk about the principles of congregational governance.
The heart of the matter.
And our sources consistently emphasize these two core tenets: autonomy and independence of the local church.
Pillars of the congregational model.
They really are. So can you elaborate a bit on what these principles mean in a practical sense?
Yeah.
How does a church operate under this model?
Well, the key thing to understand is that each congregation within this framework, they have a remarkable degree of self-governance. They are autonomous.
They hold the reins.
They do indeed. And this autonomy covers many aspects of the church's life. How they manage their internal affairs, how they conduct their outreach, who they decide to partner with, and very importantly, how they choose their own leaders.
They are truly self-governing.
Exactly. It's not just theoretical. This means decisions about, well, everything from worship style and community outreach to the church budget, even who leads the congregation. It's all decided by the members of that specific church.
There's no need for approval from a higher authority, is there?
No, not at all. It's a truly bottom-up structure. The local church assembly, comprised of its members, that is the ultimate decision-making body.
Voz, vez e voto, as the Brazilians say, right?
Voice, time, and vote. A beautiful expression that captures the essence of congregational governance.
It emphasizes that every single member has a right to participate, to have a say in the direction their church takes.
Is
And, the sources really drive home this concept of the sovereignty of the local church, almost to the point of it being, well, an untouchable principle, something that cannot be compromised.
Absolutely. The underlying belief is that the local congregation's inherent authority, its ability to govern itself, these are paramount. They should not be sacrificed for any other organizational principles or external pressures.
Now, it's really interesting because while this form of governance, this structure, is a defining characteristic of congregational movements worldwide, the sources are very clear about emphasizing that Brazilian congregationalism has a unique, independent origin story.
Yes, this is a crucial distinction to make.
Despite similarities in how churches organize themselves and this very structure we're discussing, there wasn't a direct lineage, a direct line from Europe or North America to Brazil.
That's exactly right. Brazilian congregationalism didn't emerge as a branch or an offshoot of those existing international movements. It developed independently.
Which is why Robert Calley's position as this non-denominational missionary is so essential to understanding the story, isn't it?
Absolutely.
He wasn't sent or supported by any established denomination. He arrived independently, guided by his own conviction, his own vision.
A true pioneer forging his own path.
And the term indenominational is crucial here, right?
Yeah.
It underscores the fact that these early churches weren't part of any pre-existing established Protestant structure.
Right, they were charting their own course.
And this spirit of independence, this carving their own path, is even reflected in the initial name they choose for their organization back in 1913.
The Convenção de Igrejas Evangélicas Indenominacionais, the Convention of Indenominational Evangelical Churches.
It's a very clear signal, isn't it? An affirmation of their distinct and separate origin. But then just a few years later, in 1916, the name congregational enters the picture.
Yes, leading to the formation of the Aliança das Igrejas Evangélicas Congregacionais Brasileiras e Portuguesas. A mouthful, I know.
It is. But the sources suggest that this wasn't a smooth or universally accepted change. There was discussion, even some resistance, to adopting this name.
Oh, absolutely. And the reasons behind this resistance are fascinating.
Do tell.
Well, part of it stemmed from the very thing we just discussed, the lack of a clear historical connection.
No direct lineage to the American or English traditions.
Exactly. And this made many leaders hesitant. They were aware of this lack of historical ties, but there was also a growing concern about potential theological differences, especially regarding the rise of theological liberalism in some of those international congregational groups. And there were differences in practice, particularly around infant baptism.
So there was this sense of caution, a desire to avoid a label that might imply a connection or shared theology that wasn't entirely accurate.
Precisely. They didn't want to be misrepresented or misunderstood.
So it was about protecting their distinct identity, their unique development.
Exactly. But the name congregational was eventually adopted, primarily because the way these Brazilian churches were already functioning, with such a strong emphasis on local autonomy, on the independence of each church, it aligned perfectly with the core principles of congregational governance.
The structure was already in place.
It was. In this instance, the form of church government they practiced, their lived experience, outweighed the absence of a direct historical lineage.
Which takes us to the further evolution of the denomination.
Right. The story continues to unfold.
Our sources detail a series of name changes over the subsequent years, eventually culminating in the establishment of the União das Igrejas Evangélicas Congregacionais do Brasil, UIECB, in 1969.
Solidifying their identity, their structure.
Exactly. And it's important to understand that the UIECB, as it exists today, it functions as a democratic organization. It serves the interests and needs of the individual local churches.
A support system, not a ruling body.
Exactly. It doesn't operate in a top-down hierarchical manner. It doesn't dictate to these autonomous congregations.
It's a reflection of that foundational belief in the sovereignty of each local church.
Which is made abundantly clear in the sources. The denomination explicitly views itself as a servant to the churches. It even goes so far as to say that individual churches can exist and operate entirely independently of the denomination if they choose to do so.
It's a powerful statement. It emphasizes the deep respect for local autonomy that underpins the entire movement.
It really does. And the sources also provide some really interesting examples of significant actions of institutions that were established throughout history that involved members of congregational churches.
Right, showcasing their contributions to Brazilian society as a whole.
Exactly. The founding of the Hospital Evangélico de Rio de Janeiro in 1887 is a prime example. And then there's their early support for the Associação Cristã de Moços, ACM, in Rio, starting in 1893. And even the hosting of the XI World Sunday School Convention in 1932.
These are all remarkable achievements, signs of their active engagement in the community.
And it highlights their commitment to social, educational, even religious aspects of Brazilian life.
It demonstrates that while they fiercely maintain their local autonomy, their self-governance, these churches, these individuals, they're not isolated. They contribute, they engage.
And where does the UIECB stand today? I mean, our sources give us some figures from January 2020.
Right.
It indicates a rather substantial number of active pastors and affiliated churches across the country, not to mention the regional associations, confederations, even mission fields. It seems like a pretty well-established and influential presence within Brazilian Protestantism.
Oh, absolutely. The congregational movement in Brazil, despite its unique and independent beginnings, it's grown into a major, nationally recognized denomination with a wide reach. And the way it's organized reflects both its commitment to supporting its member churches, but also that deep respect for their individual autonomy.
It's quite the journey.
It is.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive, let's recap the essential points, the key takeaways. Brazilian Congregationalism has this truly fascinating and distinct origin story.
A story shaped by individuals, by circumstance, by a steadfast commitment to principle.
And a central figure in that story is, of course, Robert Cowley, this independent missionary who operated outside the traditional denominational structures. And a core characteristic that emerged from this unique beginning is that unwavering emphasis on the autonomy, on the self-governance of each local church.
Absolutely. And it's worth repeating, despite the similarities in how churches are organized, in that shared structure of governance, Brazilian Congregationalism developed separately, independently, no direct line from the movements in Europe or North America.
And this brings us to a final and I think quite thought-provoking point for you, our listener, to consider. Given this independent spirit, this strong sense of autonomy that defines its very foundation, how might this unique history continue to shape the Brazilian congregational movement as it exists today?
It's a question worth pondering.
And how will this commitment to local autonomy play out in an increasingly interconnected world?
It's a dynamic interplay, isn't it? Local independence within a larger context of global connection. How the Brazilian congregational movement continues to navigate this balance in the years to come, that's something to watch, something to consider.
Definitely food for thought. If you're interested in exploring this further, we encourage you to delve deeper into the broader history of Protestantism in Brazil and to really give some thought to the principles underpinning congregational church governance. It's a fascinating subject full of nuance and complexity. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.